This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's podcast is sponsored by Rabbi Michael and Jerry Laxaminer for the refuah shlema of their granddaughter, Abigail Sarah Bat Shena Arona. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Vayera opens with God assuring Moshe that he will be present and help the people despite the current overload of their slave responsibilities. Moshe is sent to the people to assure them, but he isn't successful. His initial faltering confidence is certainly not strengthened by these initial bumps. After this, we read a genealogical list which claims to detail the descendants of Yaakov, but which really focuses on the Levitic family tree. This list provides further support for Moshe and Aaron's leadership position. While the people are currently unconvinced that salvation will be delivered through them, the reader is informed that success will eventually arise from this family. Then we meet the plague's opening act. Aaron performs a sign for Paro when he turns his staff into a snake. And while the magicians can perform the same wonder, Aaron's staff then swallows theirs, reflecting the ultimate power of God. But even this impressive feat does not move Paro, and God proceeds with the plagues program. This week's Parsha includes the first 7 plagues. This week's Haftorah portion is taken from Yechezkel Kafchet and Kaftet, 28 through 29. This prophecy, which is a prophecy against Egypt and Paro, it condemns Paro's pride for claiming the Nile as his own and for acting as a false source of security for Israel. Egypt is judged for its arrogance and for failing those who relied upon it. The chapter also explains that Nebuchadnezzar of Babel will be given Egypt as compensation for his long siege of Tzur, and it ends with the promise that Israel's strength and hope will be renewed when God's purpose is fulfilled. I'm so happy to have Dr. Yael Ziegler. Hi, Yael.
Hi, Yosefa.
Back on the podcast. Dr. Ziegler is a senior lecturer here at Matan and at Herzog College. Yael is the author of several wonderful commentaries on Tanakh and currently working on a book on Shmot and on a Megillot commentary. It's very exciting to know that you have more books in the waiting for us, Bezrat Hashem. So I'm really happy to be sitting back down with you for this. And, we have a lot of Yeshayahu, a lot of Yechezkel. We're going to have Yirmiyahu coming up also. And I really think that it's just so important each time for us to sort of find ourselves geographically within the book of Yechezkel, remind ourselves who's speaking, and also obviously the deep impact their character has on the content of what they're saying. And before we even get into Yechezkel specifically, I just want us to first notice, and I would almost say inspired by last week's episode with Adina Blaustein, I just want us to notice that the Haftorah doesn't really start with the prophecy to Egypt, doesn't start really with Kaftet. It starts with the last 2 psukim of Perek Kafchet, and we spoke about a little bit sort of like the copying or the cutting and pasting of different parts in order to open with something very, very clear for this Haftorah. And it opens, Ko amar Adonai Hashem bekavtzi et Beit Yisrael min ha'amim asher nafotzu bam v'nikdashti bam le'enei hagoyim v'yashvu al admatam asher natati le'avdi Yaakov. That the prophecy opens with not the message to Egypt, but with this sweeping statement at the end of a different prophecy to another Gentile nation. But it opens up with this image of Am Yisrael being gathered together, and that we are going to be Mekadeshim Hashem, and that it opens up Dafka with an image of Am Yisrael, which of course is very comforting because we're still in the middle of the plagues. We just ended the Parsha. And so you could see very much that the Baalei Haftarah, or sort of the way that they made this choice, is not to open directly with Nu, Mitzrayim, you're going to have a downfall, which they'll say in a moment, but it opens Dafka with a very comforting statement, Dafka to Am Yisrael. And I think that that's an important piece to mention because, again, we often don't notice that, actually they took some psukim from the previous part and then put it with the next part, but it's a very clear choice to open that way and not just directly with looking at Egypt's downfall. It's Egypt's downfall so that we can then be a flourishing nation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point that you're making is it's a very strong point, especially because Perek Kaftet Pasuk Aleph opens a new section, right?
Yeah.
Bashana ha'asirit. And so not to start with that opening, because we don't obviously accept the chapter divisions as something that binds us, but in this situation, chapter 29 clearly opens a new section, and it's a new section in Sefer Yechezkel, which begins several chapters of prophecies against Egypt. What is interesting about the Haftarah, and I actually think it's one of the reasons means that this particular parak is chosen from within the Egypt prophecies, because Yechezkel is going to prophesy to Egypt in 29, in 30, in 31, and in 32. This is a very long prophecy. Yeah. So why does he specifically choose this one? Well, there are probably several reasons, but one of which I think is that this prophecy, he's able to open it, as you said, with a prophecy, a positive prophecy to Am Yisrael, and to close it with a positive prophecy to Am Yisrael. The very last pasuk is Bayom ha'u atzmiach keren leveit Yisrael ulecha eten pitchon peh betocham v'yadu ki ani Hashem. Right. So on that day, I'm going to make Am Yisrael great again, basically, is the paraphrase. And so this, and
the Yediat Hashem, which is the overt purpose of the plague program also in Egypt.
Yeah, and it's the refrain of this whole section.
What we spoke about last week, Yael, was basically this idea that there is such an intentional way of choosing these Haftorahs. And it's not just, we'll grab that parak, or we'll grab that parak in terms of the way the Masoretes divide the parakim, but that there's a very overt choice, often to end with comfort, right? That the way that they break it up is not always totally in line with just, we'll start at the beginning, end of this prophecy, but they'll add on pieces before, they'll add on pieces after in order to create something that's more whole. So exactly, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, well, look, there is always an attempt not to end with something negative, and with very few exceptions, that's what we do. That's also why we have the minhag, what we call yatkak, where when we conclude 4 books, Yeshayahu, Treyasar, Kohelet, and Kinot, which is Echa, we repeat the second to last pasuk because the last pasuk is not a good pasuk. In this Haftarah, what's interesting is what you pointed out at the very beginning, which is that we also add on something at the beginning because we're interested in, I think because of what you said, because Parshat Ve'era is not a parsha that ends by taking Am Yisrael out of Egypt. We end in the middle of the plagues. We end with the plague of hail, with Barad, and so Am Yisrael is still deeply, deeply in the throes of slavery. And so in order to perhaps offer some relief, Chazal offer, first of all, of course, a prophecy against Egypt, which is, Egypt, you're high right now, we're going to make you low, right? We're going to strike at your sense of arrogance and your heightened sense of self. But even perhaps more significantly, the Haftarah is surrounded by these positive descriptions of Am Yisrael.
Exactly. So maybe right before we go deeper into the content of the prophecy, why don't we speak a little bit about just this idea of the Nivulot La'amim, these units of prophecy within our greatest prophets that are directed at the other nations around us, and also maybe a little bit specifically about Yechezkel's, might we call it an obsession with certain nations over others?
That's right, yeah. So first of all, just generally speaking, this topic of Nivuot La'amim, right, these prophecies against other nations, appear in every major prophetic book, right? So Yeshayahu has a collection from chapter 13 through chapter 23, with the exception of chapter 22. And we have a collection at the end of the book of Yirmiyahu, starting in chapter 46. And even in some of the shorter prophetic books, we have in Amos, the first parak of Amos is devoted to the other nations, his prophecies against other nations. The second chapter of the book of Tzfanya. And actually, 2 of those books are completely about prophecies to other nations. We have Ovadiah, which is 1 chapter, and it's all a prophecy to Edom. And then we have the book of Nahum, which is all pretty much, it's 3 chapters, but it's almost completely a prophecy against Nineveh. And then, of course, we have the book of Yonah, where Yonah is actually sent to Nineveh. So this raises, and I didn't even mention, of course, in Sefer Yechezkel, we have beginning in chapter 25, all the way through chapter 32, we have that collection of prophecies to other nations. There's actually a total of 7 nations that Yechezkel speaks to outside of Israel. So I guess the most sort of basic question is why, right? What's the goal of the do these prophets actually go to, to Mitzrayim, to Ammon, to Moab and say, hear ye, right? I have a prophecy. And are they taking them seriously? Are they listening to them? I mean, we do have Yonah going to Nineveh, right?
I would even put another example of there is when is when Elisha goes to the king Hazael in Aram, and he seeks out his guidance. He's ill. He wants to hear what Elisha has to say. So we know that that's to me the best example, where we know that like our Israelite prophets, I mean, he was also a miracle worker. It was like another subcategory of prophet, but they had a reputation. Like they were clearly sought after. Naaman also we have, again, that's specifically around Elisha, but I think it's a significant example. We clearly weren't as anonymous as we usually would assume.
Yeah, well, I would say not only it is a significant example, it's probably the only example aside from Yonah. So, I mean, again, but that raises the question, is the goal of these prophecies to actually speak to the nations?
Right. Who's the intended audience?
Who's the intended audience? One possibility is yes. I mean, again, the Tanakh has universalist messages and aims, right? I mean, look at the fact that the first 11 chapters of the Tanakh are not about Am Yisrael. We don't have Am Yisrael until Avram appears on the scene at the end of Bereshit, the 11th chapter of Bereshit. So it could be that the answer is yes, God is concerned not just about Am Yisrael, he's concerned about all of the nations, and he wants the nations not just to know his presence and to recognize his presence, but to behave with a certain moral approach in light of recognizing God's presence. So that's one approach. And again, I think that these approaches that I'm going to bring up can coexist. It could be that part of this is to show that God sends his prophets also with a message for the other nations.
But it would require us to understand that the surrounding nations had respect for our prophets, which, as we said, we only have one example of it with Elisha, and we have the example of Yonah. He himself has an internal opposition, but the people seem to take him seriously. So if we're going with those examples, we have to assume that they had some sort of standing. I'll say one other thing also, which is that I'm pretty sure that in the ancient world, we don't really have testimony to the fact that there were prophets like the way we had prophets in other nations. Is that true?
Bilam.
Yeah. I'm saying, but Bilam is our example. But I definitely remember learning this in my academic studies, that meaning Nevi'ei HaKtav, or having like these you had predictors, you had seers,
right,
but you didn't have these kind of classical prophets who are bringing a long message from God. It's not like, should I go there tomorrow or should I sell my sheep, right? But it's these much longer kind of speeches from God. It could be that was a trait that they sought out in the Israelite prophets. I don't know.
We do have it with Bilam. We have archaeological evidence of a very long prophecy said by Bilam, which is written on a wall in Der Al, I think it's called, on the other side of the Jordan. So that's an extraordinary piece of evidence, and it very much matches, I think, what the Tanakh is saying about Bilam. But again, we don't have necessarily evidence of the amount of prophets that we have, or necessarily even the same kinds of goals as our prophets. It's hard to say, really.
Look, approach.
Yeah. But even if we say that one approach is that these prophecies are designed for the nations, it doesn't necessarily mean that means that our prophets went to the nations. Yeah. It might mean that, again, like Nivu'ah, that is written down so that we should all understand that God has expectations from the other nations and not just from us. Yeah. So that's one approach, and I think it's correct. I think it's part of the idea here. Another approach is that the intended audience is Am Yisrael, and that when God speaks about the other nations to Am Yisrael, there are several goals in mind. One is comfort to Am Yisrael. It's consolation. If Am Yisrael has, an aggressive nation, or a nation that is behaving aggressively towards it, and is in a place of, a position of power, and the Navi comes and says, well, I'm going to destroy your power, that's very comforting in the bigger picture, right? So, these might be to some degree also Nivu'ot Nechama. Another possibility, meaning prophecies of consolation. Another possibility is that within these prophecies, the message is for Am Yisrael to understand that God is not just a narrow God of Israel, but that God is the broader God who is determining what's happening in the world and who has a goal for the whole world. That's similar to what we said in the beginning. But the final possibility is that Am Yisrael is the intended recipient of these prophets to the nations, because embedded within God's warnings to the nations are also warnings for Am Yisrael.
Right. Learn from their likely negative example.
That's right.
Right? That's a great example of that. It really is the beginning of Amos, meaning goes through all of the sins of the other nations and then gets right to Yehuda and Am Yisrael. So that I think that's, I think as you said before, these are probably all coexisting, all of these explanations. And the fact that we don't have great proof for, the other nations receiving these prophecies, it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. We have a lot of things that we don't have great proof for, just for the elapse of time. But I think that piece is really important, and we're going to keep that in mind as we see other prophecies to the nations that, of course, are going to come up. Maybe let's just also connect the ideas we said right now about the prophecies of the nations and look specifically at the way that Yechezkel, the way that he addresses the nations, specifically too.
Yeah. Okay, so the first chapter in Yechezkel, chapter 25, he very briefly addresses several nations, right? So he addresses Ammon, and then he addresses Moab and Seir, which is, of course, Edom, and the Plishtim. And that's all very, very brief. And then what he does is he spends the bulk of his time speaking to two different nations. From Perek Kavav, from the beginning of chapter 26 until the middle of chapter 28, or really towards the end of chapter 28, he is speaking to Tzor, right, which is known as Phoenicia, right, Tyre, and at the very, very end, he tacks on also a prophecy to Sidon, which is along with Tzor,
sister kingdom,
right, the sister kingdom, and that's kind of a big collection of his prophecies. He spends a great deal of time and attention. We're not going to talk about it right now. I'll just sort of say in one sentence that his major message to Tzor and Sidon, who are not really enemies of Am Yisrael,
Lebanon area.
Yeah, the Lebanon area, the coastal Lebanon area, is that their prosperity has led to their ruin, to their arrogance. And ultimately, that's his major message. I mean, it is a very prosperous nation.
As coastal nations tended to be, because they had access to all that trade.
Yeah, and one thing that I think I would say in that nations, in some sort of positive portrayal of the nation, is that Tzor and Sidon partnered with Shlomo in building the Beit HaMikdash. And I think that there is also an embedded critique of Tzor and Sidon, who were given the great privilege of being part of building this very glorified house for God, but still didn't properly internalize what wealth should be used for. So that's his approach to Tzor and Sidon. We then have, at the end of this collection of prophecies against Tzor and Sidon, we have these two psukim that we're going to read as the beginning of our Haftorah, which are directed towards Am Yisrael, and they almost seem to break up the address to
Tzor and Sidon and to Mitzrayim.
Right, the two powers that Yechezkel is particularly, you use the word obsessed, particularly interested in, starting from Perek Kaftet, which is our Haftorah, all the way through Perek Lamed Bet. He has these prophecies to Egypt, and that is clearly the other power that he's particularly interested in, Yechezkel.
I just think that that's interesting, obviously, because Yechezkel's time period is really overlapping, obviously, with the Babylonian defeat of Am Yisrael. So why do we think that his attention is so drawn to Egypt?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And Tzor and Sidon. What's actually interesting about both of these powers is that neither of them at this time are enemies of Am Yisrael.
I'm saying they're not the threat at the moment, as far as I had learned.
No, they're the opposite. They're the ones that the kings of Yehuda are allying themselves with against Bavel. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if he reserves his greatest criticism for those nations that seem to be leading Am Yisrael into this illusion of that there's an address out there other than God.
Right, that we can have alliances at all.
Yeah.
Right, meaning something with that kind of aligning ourselves with these nations that are known to be very wealthy and successful, meaning they don't just think they are. They may not be the strongest power in the region at the moment, but they have that sort of wealth. Meaning I think it continues this idea of all the prophets tend to make us feel very concerned about aligning with other nations around us. Like they kind of want to keep us through this line of sort of an Am Levadad Yishkon. I'm saying something very general, and obviously there are a lot of nuances in it, but we have, so many times the prophets are going to come and say, no, don't make that alliance. No, or they'll say, don't rebel and play along with power X for the time being so that we can return to being a sovereign power, right? In the case of Yirmiyahu and Bavel. So this point about, are we supposed to be friends with the people around us, or are we not supposed to be friends with people around us, which obviously has an insane amount of modern, right, echoing, I think is a piece that comes off very strongly. But I will just notice that it's very interesting that he's really prophesying to Egypt and to these northern kingdoms that don't seem to be the problem at the moment.
Yeah. So. Look, the two problems which we have here with these alliances are what you said. Number one, over-reliance on any sort of nation and not on God. Yeah. And number two is that Yirmiyahu has already told the people, you have to subjugate yourselves to the yoke of Bavel. For the present, it's part of your punishment. It's part of God's plan. And if you don't do so, then things are going to get worse. And of course they do. And who do they ally themselves with? Tzor and Sidon and Egypt. Yeah. So, that seems to account for the particular focus on these powers.
Yeah. So what is Yechezkel's criticism? Let's go a little bit deeper into this particular prophecy. Right? He has some very powerful psukim here about Paro as a figure. We have here in Pasuk Gimel, right? Daber ve'amarta כה אמר אדוני השם, הנני עליך פרעה מלך מצרים, התנים הגדול הרובץ בתוך יאוריו, אשר אמר לי יאורי ואני עשיתיני. Right? We have this image of this rallying against Paro, who he sort of takes ba'alut, he takes ownership over this tremendous source of fecundity, which is the Nile River. So let's think a little bit more about those images.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that he doesn't name the Paro here. We know how to name Paro. Yeah. He doesn't name him because he's talking about every Paro that ever existed, right? Yeah. The Paro
Paro.
Yeah, the everyman, right? The everyman Paro. And the story here of that Paro is that, first of all, he's that great crocodile, right? Tanim here is not jackal, of course, but it seems to be a plural of crocodiles, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe a singular of crocodile. The crocodile, of course, is the ultimate predator. He has no one that can, right? The crocodile has no enemies, right? In the food chain, right? He's the highest one, and the Paro seems to place himself as the non-vulnerable figure, right? The one who is above any sort of reproach or any sort of danger. And the most important thing is, I think, that the Paro self-deifies, that he presents himself as a god. And as a god, it's not just that he's taking credit for the economic well-being of Egypt, it's that he says, I created Egypt. I created the Nile River.
Yeah, of course, again, this is obviously also, it's in dialogue with the fact that the Nile is identified as a central feature of Egypt, but of course it's connecting us also to the Parsha, where we have the fact that, obviously the Nile went beyond his control in this week's Parsha, right. And there was a change that happens, whereas here, we're presenting him, it's honestly, it's a degree of mocking, right? It's a degree of mocking. Oh, you think you're in charge of that Nile, but you're not going to be in charge of that Nile, nor were you in charge of that Nile then in this week's Parsha, right? That's so right, there's a connection between all those pieces.
Right, especially given that the first two plagues show that the Paro can't control the Nile. It can't control the Nile itself, and it can't control what comes out of the Nile. And that's also, I think, that there's something about that that's very symbolic, right? As the Nile, which is a source of life, becomes this kind of source of death, right? It brings blood, but then it also spews forth these putrid creatures all over the land, and that's I think it's a scathing critique of what Egypt has given to the world.
And I just want to connect to what you said before, that in Pasuk Vav, it says, וידעו כל יושבי מצרים, כי אני אדוני, ין היותם משענת קנה לבית ישראל. It also uses the same phrase in Melachim Bet, but this idea of משענת קנה, that you're not someone that can be relied upon, right? You're like this, malleable reed. I don't know how to really translate that well into English, but it's obviously referring to the reeds that, right, are by the Nile. But you, Mitzrayim, you're not a reliable source of friendship, right? So it's going back to the idea we said before about how Am Yisrael relies on them, but they really shouldn't, and using the image of the elements that are by the Nile.
Yeah, well, in the end, they do betray Am Yisrael this time. Yes, of course they do, yes. So, Yehuda and Tzidkiyahu had hoped that Egypt was going to come save them from Bavel, and at the last minute, Egypt turns around and goes home. Yes. And that political betrayal, which I think is part of the source of why the prophets keep saying to Am Yisrael, don't rely on your human alliances, right? As Henry Kissinger famously said, nations don't have friends, they only have interests.
Right.
Yeah. So that's I think partially what the prophets here are saying. You can engage in all sorts of political machinations, but the only thing that you can really rely upon is God, and keep that in mind, right?
Yeah. You know what else we didn't mention somehow, but this prophecy, the date of the prophecy that opens, it's B'shana Asirit V'asiri V'shnemasar L'chodesh, that this date is the 12th of Tevet in the 10th year. And this is a half year before the wall is broken, right? And the Mikdash is destroyed. So it's very, very, this is actualia. This is really happening right now, that we're relying on Egypt, but it's going to go really, really bad really soon. I mean, it's almost really bad already. But of course, this is a really important piece. The siege has already begun 1 year before this prophecy on the 2nd of Tevet in the 9th year of Tidkiyahu. So I'm just saying we're like really, really right on the eve almost, right? 6 months away from the Churban. So it's important for us to also to place this prophecy in time. It's one of the really fun things, by the way, about Yechezkel, that he has dates, right? It's a real relief after, the book of Yirmiyahu where there aren't enough dates, really.
So another interesting element here that we have in this Haftorah is that we have all these descriptions of what's going to happen to Egypt that kind of recall what happens to Am Yisrael when Am Yisrael is forced out of Egypt. And I say deliberately forced out of Egypt because it's not an easy experience for Am Yisrael. Like one might think
we think of it as a liberation, but this was really, really difficult for them.
It's an expulsion.
Yes.
Also, I mean, even the word bishalach, right? Yeah. Like he bishalach paro et ha'am, and we have this sense of girush, right? They expel them from Egypt. The Egyptians expel Israel from Egypt. What happens, of course, to Israel? They go into the desert for 40 years. They're wandering around the desert before they're ready to begin the next stage. Well, what's interesting in this section is that after describing Paro as this crocodile who's swimming in his Nile, God says, I'm going to dry up the Nile. I'm going to take you out of the Nile. Look in Pasuk Hey, unitashticha hamidbara. I'm going to abandon you in a desert. You and all the fish that are with you, you're going to fall onto this field and you're going to, remain there vulnerable for others to eat you, right? Yeah. And then we're told that they're going to have a revival, right? So if you look ahead in Pasuk Yud Aleph, in Pasuk Yud Bet, maybe we'll start in Pasuk Yud Gimel, but it's repeated several times, there's a 40-year period in which Egypt is now in a state of, disarray or in a state in which they're in the desert, right? So 40 years in the desert, that suggests that there's something parallel about the punishment of Egypt and what happens to Am Yisrael when Egypt expels them from their land. Look in Pasuk Yud Gimel, Ki ko amar Hashem Elokim miketz 40 shana, akabetz et Mitzrayim. At the end of the 40 years, I will gather Mitzrayim min ha'amim asher nafotu sham, from the nations which they were spread out there, right? V'shavti et shvut Mitzrayim. This is language that we have about Am Yisrael throughout the Nevi'im. I'm going to return Mitzrayim, v'ashivoti otam eretz patros al eretz mechuratam. I'm going to return them to their birthplace. V'hayu sham mamlacha shfala. And they will be there a lowly, humble nation. Min hamamlachot tiyeh shefala v'lo titnaseh od al hagoyim. Among the kingdoms, they are going to be lowly. They will not be, able to rise up above the other nations. V'hima'atetim levilti ridot bagoyim. And I'm going to make them very few so that they won't be able to torment other nations. Okay, so now on the one hand, this sounds like a punishment. And as part of the punishment, it seems as though they have to go through a similar kind of experience as Am Yisrael. On the other hand, I'm going to suggest something else, which I think is a larger theme that we see throughout the Tanakh, and that is that this is less a punishment and more a corrective.
Yeah, it's like a refinement process.
Yeah. Just like with Am Yisrael going through the desert. But what I think that we have to conclude from here, and I think that this really does cohere with a lot of ideas in Tanakh, is that the aspirational goal for Egypt here is to be a mamlacha shefala, is to be a lowly nation. This notion that, a nation wants to be an empire and it wants to be a superpower and it wants to be at the head of the, of the family of nations, that's something that I think many of the prophets are saying, be careful what you wish for, because the end of all of these nations, both because of their arrogance and their prosperity, is that they self-implode, right?
And also even in an inability to control such a massive amount of land and peoples, meaning it's not viable.
That's right. All imperialistic expansion will self-implode. Yeah. But it's not only that, it's also this aspiration to be at the top, at the head. So there's something about saying to Egypt, look, it didn't work with you to be at the head, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to let you back in, right? We're not completely destroying you. They're not stone. They're not being destroyed.
Or a dome in those cases, meaning some of the prophecies are that they'll completely be destroyed and we don't know anything about them.
Yeah, so that's not what Yechezkel is saying here about Egypt. Instead, you're going to come back, you're going to be a lowly nation, and you'll re-enter the family of nations, but not at the head. Now, I do want to sort of say one other thing, which is that I think that Am Yisrael also is meant to be.
I just wanted to say that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
No, say it. I was thinking about that exactly. Not only are they following our developmental process, but we also are supposed to be a non-imperialistic power that is characterized by humility, right? That's everywhere. It's who our leader is supposed to be, our king's supposed to be like that, and all of our greatest prophets, they criticize us also, right? That's one of the main themes in Sefer Yeshayahu, is when we were still at the helm of really being a more powerful kingdom than we certainly are at the time of Yechezkel, was that we have this ge'ava, meaning it seems to be that this is also the goal for Am Yisrael. We should be a mamlecha shvela. We should be a nation that knows its place in the world, that is caring and curating a moral society where we are, but not looking to take over other spaces.
Okay, so yeah.
That's not what you're going to say.
It's partially what I was going to say, and I actually agree with especially that last sentence. Yeah. Because I think that there's something a little more nuanced that I want to say, which is that it's true that we are not meant to be imperialistic. I say that all the time, and I think it's super important because I think the end of every imperialistic power is that they self-implode. Their own insatiable qualities of wanting more and more and more. It's never ever satisfied. But on the other hand, I think to be a mamlecha shvala is not the whole goal. Whereas Am Yisrael is meant to be a very an important power. I would even maybe call it a superpower, but not for the purposes of taking over land. Because we are meant to be imperialistic, but only theologically, right? Umal'ah ha'aretz et Hashem, right? Umal'ah ha'aretz de'at Hashem miyam layam mechasim, right? We're meant to fill the world with knowledge of God. So it is a nuanced kind of position.
No, I think it's really important.
Yes, at the head, right? In a sense, right? A superpower in a sense, but to keep a check on our own arrogance, and in order to realize that the goal of all of this is to promote God. Right, and I want to say one more thing about Egypt, which is that Egypt is a power long before Israel becomes a power. Right, sure. It's a built-up society, and even the Tanakh recognizes that. Right, that Egypt is there and it exists and it's an important society. And there's even a midrash that seems to suggest what I'm going to say. I'll say it a little bit more explicitly than the midrash, which is that Egypt gets its chance. It gets its chance. It's given leadership, and it fails. It doesn't manage to use its leadership for good. Instead of assuming its role as leader of the world to lead the world to a more positive place, it doesn't. It only brings bad things to the world. So it's been disqualified for leadership. That's why it has to be a mamlecha shvala. Now Am Yisrael has that role. And Am Yisrael is given a lot of tools in order to achieve it and not to fail. The Tanakh is trying to give Am Yisrael this role with a lot of support.
I know we're a Tanakh podcast, but your description right now is bringing me to the present. And meaning, if a prophet was looking at us right now and writing a prophecy, I'm not sure that we would be successful yet at what we've been given the power to do. I'm saying that seriously, meaning I think that in Dafka and some of the challenges of the modern era, what we're doing now, we're closer to it than we ever have been in the past. But I think that there's a lot of challenge, meaning I don't think we've yet stepped into the shoes of that role. I think that we have the potential to be there, but we're not there yet. I'm just saying that seriously because I take these prophecies very seriously. And I don't want to just leave it, 2,000 years ago. I think that because I think ultimately we would like to be that. And we're definitely not looking to be an imperial power. That's never been our goal. And I don't think that's going to change. But this question about, with all of the complex feelings and perspectives about the land of Israel, which is, it seems to be because people's eyes are on this region of the world, how are we able in like a long-term plan to actually try and be some sort of, sometimes it gets called an Or LaGoyim, but as we said, to sort of be, as you said, a theological superpower. I think that the potential is there.
I would say that success is not something that we will ever achieve in terms of stasis.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't think that there's a goal or that there's a realistic aspiration that we'll get to a place and then we will be in the place that we want to be. There's constantly dangers and there's constantly possibility of falling prey to our own human proclivity for arrogance and for,
and some aggressive neighbors.
Yeah. No, I'm certainly not weighing in on every detail of what we're supposed to be. But I mean, in terms of the broader picture, right? We do have to be vigilant all the time. We do have to be thinking through all the time our decisions. If we're using them, not even, explicitly to spread God's name in the world, but to spread God's morality in the world, to make sure that, or to try to make sure that we are a nation that has our eye on being moral and spreading, the goodness of what Am Yisrael is meant to be. So these are things I think that we're never going to be able to give a check and say, we've achieved it, but that there are things that we need to keep our eye on and to be aware of. And that's why I think that while Egypt had its turn and was unsuccessful and therefore disqualified from the running, it has to be a mamlacha shfala now. And we read this, and as you said, we also have to take home the lesson from it, right? If we want to be successful, we have to also bear in mind what we can't be.
Well, that would be a nice place to end. I just want us to say one more thing, because the end of the prophecy has this kind of not unusual, we'll talk about that, but this funny way of ending. And there's actually a prophecy embedded within a prophecy here meant to kind of comfort Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel. So why don't we just look at that last piece there, because it's right there. And this message to Nebuchadnezzar that Yechezkel is offering.
Yeah, so God says to Yechezkel, I didn't give you proper reward when you conquered from conquering Tzor, because as we know, Tyre, is not conquered by the Babylonians. It's not conquered until Alexander the Great, who, Tzor is on some kind of island, and it's really hard to conquer. And so Alexander the Great conquers it. And so this pasuk seems to indicate that Nebuchadnezzar didn't get the proper reward. It didn't get spoils of war from its war with Tzor. So God says, okay, so, I'll give you Egypt and you can take your reward there. You can have your pickings there. And that's, schar lechelo. That's his reward for his soldiers. So this does cohere with the picture that's portrayed by Yirmiyahu of Nebuchadnezzar.
Avdi.
Who's called by God Avdi.
Yeah.
Now, he's not the only one that God calls my servant, right? God says about Ashur, Hoi Ashur Shevet Api, right? In Yeshayahu Perek Yud, right? He says, woe Ashur, the rod of my anger. And Nebuchadnezzar is called my servant. And then later on, Koresh is going to be called by God in Yeshayahu, Mishichi, my anointed one. So the what I think it's being portrayed here is that these bigger events of world history are orchestrated by God.
Yeah.
And that even if these events are ones that
bring us tremendous pain and difficulty.
Yeah.
That they're all God's messengers.
And they're part of the story. And Nebuchadnezzar here is fulfilling a role that God gives him. Now, part of that, I think, is also a way of understanding that just because Nebuchadnezzar, destroys God's temple, that doesn't mean that God is not powerful. That could be an obvious conclusion, and it's an erroneous conclusion, right? So you should understand that if something happens, that seems to impugn God's power, that's not the case. You may not understand the divine plan, but you have to understand that everything that happens in the world is part of a bigger plan.
Dr. Yael Ziegler, thanks for being here again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.